Sal McGee with YETicket.com. Well, I just saw a film called Two Gods, and the director of the film is by two brothers, and they also the producer too, Zeshawn and Aman, and they are American Muslims, and they're storytellers, and they're here to help create stories about American Muslims. But this film, Two Gods, is a very different story. That's something I did not expect. But anyway, welcome to YETicket.com.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us today.
Well, my first question is to you, Aman, is this. You're the producer of this film. Why did you pick this subject matter for this film? And also, Zeshawn, you can also piggyback on this too.
Yeah, I think for us, my brother and I, we live in New York City now, but we grew up in Ohio. And I think growing up, we were just frustrated of not seeing people that look like us on TV and film. And as we got older, kept seeing this over and over again when you talk about representation and who's telling these stories and this and that. And so instead of complaining, we wanted to be a part of the conversation and saying, okay, instead of just criticizing people for telling our stories, let's start telling our own stories. And so a couple of years ago, we started a project called 30 Mosques in 30 Days, where we went to every state in America to tell stories about Muslim Americans. And across the board, people just kept saying, we want to hear more stories. We want to see these stories. We want to hear more stories like this. And we set out on this path to tell nuanced stories about American Muslims. And that's what led us to come across this story. Zeshawn, want to talk about how we came across this one?
Yeah, I think in the process of sort of like kind of familiarizing ourselves with sort of like that nuanced Muslim American storytelling, we're based in New York City, and we were introduced to the Casket Shop in Newark. And it was really sort of like an obviously interesting location for a storytelling to happen in terms of like, what does a casket shop look like and what is the work? So that kind of started our journey. But really, we kind of immediately became very close with Hanif and sort of the work that he does, not only as a casket maker, but a ritual body washer. And one of the early days of filming, we were, for Quan came into the casket shop. He's one of the young protagonists of the film. And Hanif started teaching him how to build a casket, and it's actually in the film as well as a scene. But that was kind of the first moment where we saw this sort of juxtaposition of not only this man who was working around the rituals of death and the sort of like care in that space, but he was also mentoring these young men who really needed the sort of guidance of somebody to kind of like, see them as the sort of like, full of potential young men that they were. And so that sort of juxtaposition of coming of age and the rituals of death was really sort of interesting and kind of allowed us to continue exploring this sort of like very layered, very nuanced sort of Muslim American story that we were really always passionate about telling.
Yeah, and I think the other, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think for us as well, it's also about widening widening the narratives of Muslim Americans. Because I think very often when you talk about Muslims in America, it's very often talked about in a very monolithic narrative, whether it's post 9/11 or hate crimes or stories of immigration. And those are great stories and those are important stories to tell. But this is a Black American Muslim community that has been a part of the Muslim community for generations upon generations, have very rich, vibrant roots in New Jersey. And so for us, it was important to tell that story as well, because again, very often these stories in the broader American Muslim narratives aren't often talked about. And if you look at even demographics, it's hard to get exact numbers, but Black American Muslims make up about, I've seen anywhere between like 25 to like 40% of the Muslim American community. And those narratives aren't often included when you think about who is a Muslim in America.
Well, for me, growing up, it was the Black Muslims, for me, not the regular Muslims at the time, especially when I was growing up, to hear about Muslims. It's about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, people like that, but not regular Muslims until I got older, and then the world, I started learning more, and also the news started bringing out more about Muslims. But you're right, the news or features and things like that do not offer any information about the Muslims, the Black Muslim here in America. So, Zeshawn, I want to ask you about this. How much did you know about Hanif or Hanif when you decided to use him as a subject matter?
We actually met Hanif. We knew about we were kind of filming around the casket shop for actually quite a few months before. So we knew about the sort of work that he was doing. And we actually had a very sort of in-depth conversation with Hanif after the first time we met him, which was at a washing. So we were at a washing just sort of like helping out and observing, kind of spending time with Rashad, who's the owner of the casket shop. And we had this really sort of like very in-depth conversation with Hanif afterwards about sort of his work and also like his past and the way that he's sort of like found meaning in this ritual of, washing those that have passed. And, it almost, he would describe it as like the thing that saved him. And I think that was so meaningful. And so before we knew we were going to make a film, I mean, we had never made a film before. So it's not like we started this journey knowing that it was going to be a documentary film. It was that, if anything, it was just like, your work is so incredible. Like, can you tell us more about it? Can we spend time with you? Can we sort of like learn about your past? Can you teach us how to do a washing? Can you kind of show us like, introduce us to these people that And it was rooted in genuine friendship. And I think like the film really grew over the sort of like months that we were sort of like spending time with Hanif and like filming here and there and not knowing what we really had. And then we started crafting this sort of like layered piece as we kind of, continued on.
Now, Aman, did he say also, well, you're going to learn more about me, about the things that I've done and things I'm trying to do right now? Go ahead and film it. Was he okay with all of that, exposing himself to many people who watched the film?
And that's a great question. And that's something that we never took for granted or lightly since day one. And I think taking a step back even from Hanif, in Newark, New Jersey, like many communities of color around the country have just been so grossly misrepresented, portrayed. And so naturally, anybody that comes in town with the camera, the skepticism is like, oh, here we go. It's going to say this about us and this and that. And the way we approached this film was we said, well, there's a reason why people live here. There's a reason why people are proud to be a part of this community. And the approach we had with Hanif is the same approach we had with everybody is, let's see people the way they see themselves. Let's tell their story the way that they want it to be told. And it took time, naturally. And we wanted to make sure that we treated people like people and not as subjects or not as people we're trying to make a movie on. We cared about people as friends first and foremost. And so there were days we filmed, and there were days we just hung out and just chopped it up. And it's like, oh, it's my birthday, or I'm going to this party. You want to come? We'll come. No cameras, no nothing, just there to hang out. And so for us, it was always important to do that. And I think that's what led to those incredible moments you see in the film where people are being really, really honest and vulnerable. And because there was that sense of trust. And I think for us, again, our approach was we cared about them as people and not as subjects of a documentary.
Yeah, that's one thing I really enjoyed about this film, the honesty in the film. But not only that, I learned so much, like with the body washing of the dead before they are, did they get buried, or did they get cremated or anything like that?
Yeah, it's all washing before burial. So all of the people that have passed in the Muslim tradition are traditionally also being prepared for a washing, then in the casket, and then buried.
Yeah, and I noted that the caskets also they're pine. They're not elaborate like I've seen them over my lifetime. For example, when I buried my parents, they didn't have a pine casket. My sister wouldn't go for that, but so why pine caskets?
Yeah, it's actually in the Muslim tradition, it's actually like the best scenario when you're buried is just being washed, wrapped in that sort of white cloth that you see, and then being placed directly in the ground. In America, different states have different sort of like laws, and so you can't just bury a body without sort of like an enclosing of some sort, like a casket. So the idea is like keeping it as simple as possible, keeping it as sort of like minimal as possible, because really it's like once that ritual is performed, it's like one, it happens very quickly. So usually a body is buried within 72 hours, within 3 days of a body passing. So it moves very fast. And also it's about keeping it sort of like as minimal as possible. And so that's why if you do see a casket, most of the time in the Muslim tradition, it is the sort of pine box like that. It is a sort of just very basic, minimal design or kind of structure of some sort, because it really is just about a vessel to hold the body as it goes into the ground, and that's pretty much all that it is.
Yeah, I noticed that, and also, but I also noticed Hanif that his life is, well, he has a very complicated life. For example, he has a son that he has a relationship with him, but not a full father relationship. Can you talk about that? Either one of you guys?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the journey of Hanif, where we meet him in the film, and especially that moment of time where he was at, was really like, and kind of like I mentioned, like when Hanif found washings and sort of casket building, he really sort of found an opportunity to kind of like find a feeling of redemption for himself, but also like um kind of like it re-energized his life in so many ways. And so I think like the reconnection with his son Tyler was so beautiful, but that was happening in real time, like really like, he was kind of like making up for those times where he wasn't there. I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the film is this sort of like conversation that they're having as they're boxing, and it's this real sort of like actual sort of like dance almost between two, like a father and a son reckoning with past, and like how that then is going to affect their future together. I mean, it's really sort of like a vulnerable moment because Hanif, because of the sort of like period of his life where he wasn't present in Tyler's life, it's like Tyler was a child without a father for those years, and so he's kind of, they're both reckoning with what does the present mean. And I think I was really sort of, I think that's why the final scene of the film holds so much weight, because it sort of is this full circle moment where Hanif, after sort of falling and after sort of like being challenged and struggling once more, he returns to the purest form of himself, which is not only a man who is like understanding his journey is going to kind of take detours, but he's a man that can still show up and kind of define himself and be a father and be present and pass down these traditions, not only to these young men in his neighborhood, but his son. And so that was a really sort of like beautiful arc that happened in real time as we were filming. But kind of one of my favorite like threads of the film was just sort of like that growth between Hanif and Tyler, and the kind of like ways in which Hanif sort of like defined himself as a father.
Yeah, I found that very passionate, because at least he wanted to try. He didn't want to run away. He wanted to acknowledge his son, and also he also wanted to acknowledge, well, his himself as a father, that he's not the best, but he wants to try to do what he can in that moment. But also, Aman, let me talk about for Quan for a moment. And he's a 12-year-old, and now he's in this, he's in this funeral home now, working with Hanif. Did you get a chance to talk to him, and how did he feel about this?
Yeah, he was initially was a kid that was just bored at home, and just stumbled. He lives right down the street, or he lived right down the street from the casket shop, and just stumbled in one day. He was just like, "What are y'all doing? What's going on in there?" He was just bored at home. He's like, "Give him something to do." And so at first it was just kind of a hobby, and he just kept coming back because he started to have something to do and purpose. And slowly but surely, it took some time at first. There was a little bit of tension, and he's just like, all right, whatever, stop telling me what to do and this and that. And as you see in the film, as he gets older, a lot of the things that Hanif was telling him were starting to click, where he was starting to realize that he has a future, he has a purpose. And he's just grown and matured in incredible ways. Again, he was just a naughty, bratty 12-year-old kid that, you know, like every 12-year-old kid, just acting a fool, just having fun. And now he's thinking about his future, and he's thinking about his goals and what he wants to do. And he's doing great stuff now in high school, and he's got varsity letters for wrestling, and maybe getting scholarships at some point, and thinking about all that. And yeah, a lot of that came from the work that Hanif instilled upon him, and we still keep in touch. And for Quan regularly reaches out to Hanif, is like, thank you for being there for me. Thank you for teaching me that. And I may not have shown it at the time, but I want to show you now that I wouldn't be where I am today and have this drive and this focus if it wasn't for you. And it's really, really beautiful to see the man that he's continuing to grow into.
Does he want to be a filmmaker now?
The sky's the limit for him and what he wants to do. And I really think that he has an opportunity to be a leader, to be a role model, to be a spokesperson. He's gone through incredible trials and tribulations in his life, and he realizes that those things weren't in vain, that he has an opportunity now to not only continue to grow and succeed, but also use his platform that is growing to reach out to other kids that are in similar circumstances.
Now, Zeshawn, there's another character in there, Khadija, the funeral director. Well, I found her very interesting, and also I found her a woman of leadership too. Now, how was that? How was it working with that woman, and also how did she feel about being in the documentary?
I mean, Khadija was such a pivotal sort of like kind of place of and sort of like guide for us in our filming process. I mean, really, like, we learned, I think, like, as a filmmaker, you're also learning too. It's like, you know, and she's, you know, somebody who knows so much about these traditions, and she also is a pillar of the community. Every time we'd have a conversation with folks, they would always be like, they would always know who Khadija was. They had some sort of connection to her. And so I think, like, working with her in the process of filming, I think was incredibly, so much work was being done behind the scenes for her to help us sort of like connect with the right families, make sure that like we were doing things in a way that sort of like, you know, was respectful. I mean, these are also very challenging situations that we're filming in. We're filming in situations where there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of sort of like, you know, vulnerable emotions in the room. And so I think we had so much guidance and so much trust from the community because we had support from people like Khadija. And, you know, honestly, like, her passion is this work. And I think, you know, the second we came to her and told her that not only do we want to tell this story, but the way we wanted to show these washings and the way we wanted to kind of preserve these traditions with as much care and as much tenderness and respect for those that have passed, as like happens in the room when you're there, she was like, these traditions need to be documented. People need to know how much care the Muslim community gives to those that we have passed away. They need to know how much care we hold with the washing tradition and the ritual. And I think she's just excited to like have people know more about the fact that this is something that the Muslim community does all for our, you know, and it's community care, and it's sort of like uplifting these spaces where communities can grieve and gather and sort of come together. And I think she's been an incredible partner on the process of making this film.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I learned a lot about that, and also it really opened up my eyes more and more about the Muslim tradition. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was saying, "Yeah, man, watching this documentary. They're Muslims. They're washing the body and everything like that." And of course, you know, he's Christian, and he didn't know anything about that. So, what are you going to do with this film now? You've been to film festivals. What is it going to be on video on demand? Or are you going to be in a movie theater because movie theaters are opening up? How are you going to get this film out, or which way is this film going to come out?
Yeah, so May 21st, we're making our national theatrical debut. And so it's going to be in about 20 to 30 theaters across the United States. And with COVID, a lot of these screenings are being virtual. And the good thing is, no matter where you live in the US, you can watch from your home, whether you live in Nebraska or you live in Florida or California, you can still access the film. And then PBS will be airing the documentary next month, June 21st. And we also plan on doing screenings throughout communities across the country and partner with organizations and doing a lot of work because to Zeshawn's point about Khadija, one thing she really helped us help shine light on is just how grossly underprepared people are when it comes to this conversation about death. Like Albert, you mentioned your friend. Very often we don't know anything about this until it happens. Until we lose a loved one, we don't know the first thing about these funeral traditions. And so one of the things that we're looking to do over the next few months in communities is doing what we're calling life preparation workshops and also death preparation workshops, where you start talking about putting together a will. You start having conversations in your home about, God forbid, if something happens to mom and dad and they're at the hospital and on a ventilator, what are we going to do? I get that these conversations are uncomfortable, but we need to have these things now because these are going to happen. It's going to happen to everybody. We're all going to be faced with these tragedies at different points of our lives. And it's important that we normalize these conversations so that when they happen, we can comfortably grieve in as much safe space as possible and not have to worry about filling out paperwork, calling this person, scheduling this and doing that. And we know how hard these times are. And these are things that we need to do now so that when these things happen, we can make it as bearable, I guess I don't know if that's the right word, but to make it as easy as possible during these already difficult times.
Yeah, because I talk to my family members. I have a will and things like that. My girlfriend, she has a will and things like that. And I talk to my friends that I golf with and things like that. Do you have a will? No one seems to, well, many people that I know don't want to talk about that. They don't want to face that reality of death. And for example, everybody who's older than my mother, father, grandparents, they're all going, it's my generation next to die. And I mention that to my sisters and brothers, but they shudder when they think about it.
And it doesn't have to be a negative thing. And obviously the heart of our film, death is an opportunity to make the most of your life and to make the most of the relationships you have with people by thinking about death and thinking about how precious our time is. It's maximizing your life. And so for us, it doesn't have to be a morbid thing. And it's something that's a part of so many cultures. It's a beautiful, vibrant thing. And it doesn't have to be this downer or this depressing of a subject. Yes, it can be difficult, but it's something that can be actually very, very empowering, if you prioritize it.
Well, that's the way I feel about death. It's beautiful and, you're going to be part of it. So enjoy this life right now. Well, I want to say I enjoyed you two brothers. But now my one final question is, Zeshawn, let me ask you this. Why did you all decide to get into filmmaking? I noticed that I was reading a little bit about your bio that you graduated from New York University and then you did a project. But why did you two brothers decide to get into filmmaking?
I mean, I think like Aman and I have been sort of driven by storytelling from a young age. We grew up sort of like loving films, and we kind of found storytelling through very different lenses. Aman was found journalism as a real sort of like path that he was inspired by and sort of like telling stories. And to me, I was always a very sort of like visual thinker from a young age. So I was interested in film, in photography, and then I sort of like got into filmmaking because of that and cinematography. And I think like, especially after Aman did his trip on the 30 Moss sort of journey, and as I was sort of like helping out with that, we realized that we actually work very well together. And because not only do we sort of like share a shared passion for these types of storytellings kind of getting out into the world in a big way, but we also have very similar sort of like aesthetics, and it also just helps working with your brother. I mean, I think it's just like we have a shared language that we're able to sort of collaborate and
I mean, you two brothers have your own language that you communicate with each other.
It's just a shorthand. It's like a shorthand that I will say, like, I don't recommend everyone working with their siblings.
Yeah, I don't have any with my siblings.
But I do think that in the grand scheme of things, like and it helps too. Like it honestly, like you know, Hanif calls us like his brothers too. Like we really created a family unit with this film, with our subjects, and like it was always sort of grounded in sort of like just genuine love and affection for each other. And like
Right.
it was just beyond friendship. It was like we were all like brothers and siblings and kind of like taking care of each other in that sort of way. And I think that really kind of is how Aman and I like to work. We just like to just be very sort of like open and have like real relationships with people.
Yeah, and to add to that, only speaking for myself, is I just grew up just feeling so frustrated with portrayals of communities of color in general and people of color in general, and just complaining about things. And at some point, you know, instead of just talking about it, I wanted to be about it. I wanted to get involved and start telling those stories, whether in front of the camera or behind the camera, and working with that. And yes, we can't single-handedly change, you know, decades of, you know, ignorance and negligence and this and that. But we wanted to be a part of a movement. We wanted to join this growing movement where people are taking control. Instead of asking people to tell our stories, we're demanding that we tell our own stories. And I wanted to be a part of that movement where not only are we trying to tell our own stories, but trying to use our growing platform to get other people through the door and give them opportunities to tell their stories as well.
Well, you told this story very well. I really enjoyed it. I can't wait for other people to see this on PBS, but also on demand or at the movie theaters. And that's why I'm so happy to have this interview, this conversation with you two Ali brothers. Thank you very much, and much success to you in the future, and keep it up. And let me know what you're doing in the future next time you have another project. Please, I want to stay enlightened.
Will do. No, we appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day and have a great life.